So when you aim these frequencies at the ionosphere, you create an electrical chain reaction that heats the ionosphere and pushes the atmosphere up and down. The downward push is part of the dome of high pressure, sinking air. That high pressure dome circulates clockwise in the northern hemisphere. They use that like a pulley, like a flywheel, to spin the moisture up and around that high pressure dome. That's exactly what they are doing. They spin it around the U.S. West, back down into the center of the country where they ice nucleate all the moisture that should have and would have gone into California. But they completely override California, push this moisture back down into other parts of the U.S., creating the flash freeze weather whiplash cooldowns and the weather whiplash term. And I'll get to that in a moment, a term that now so many weather agencies use, a term that geoengineeringwatch.org has used for years before they picked it up because they can't hide the effect, which can only be described as weather whiplash, anymore. It's absurd. So many regions are fluctuating 50 degrees in a single day. As they get enough moisture to chemically nucleate, cold dense layer of air sinks to the ground. They create the cold temperatures for a day or two or three, flash freezing things on the ground, destroying ecosystems on the ground, toxifying everything. But they're able to create the headlines that they need to confuse and divide the population as to the true state of total planetary meltdown until the last possible moment. And that's a major factor of what they're doing, in addition to miring populations in difficulties, crushing crops, controlling food supplies, thus controlling populations. There are many, many layers to this insanity, many layers. Ionosphere heaters are core to climate engineering operations, and we have networks of other frequency transmitters, including microwave frequencies, that if an air mass is saturated with the electrically conductive particles that are being dispersed by jet aircraft, they can then manipulate those particles in the atmosphere and thus manipulate the air mass itself. There's a repelling effect. And we have recorded this in the case of, for example, the hurricanes like Hurricane Harvey that parked in place, just like the scheduled script reading meteorologist said it would. We recorded the actual transmissions as it was happening. Please search geoengineeringwatch.org hurricanes and look at every single hurricane article and every recording of these transmissions in it. It will shock you to the marrow. That's how vast these weather control scenarios are, and it is our government behind this. It's not some foreign government running transmission sites on our soil and flying planes over our soil. Of course not. What an absurd notion. And of course, governments around the globe, whatever surface conflicts that they are using to distract and divide populations, they're all involved with all of it. It can't be otherwise. They know the planet can't support populations anymore, and they're doing what they think they have to do to save themselves for a little bit longer, to hang on to their power for a little bit longer, even if no one gets out alive. And that is exactly the trajectory we are on. No one gets out alive. So back to the ionosphere heaters. High pressure domes, ridiculously resilient ridge on the west coast, blocking rain year after year after year. With that in mind, next headline. Unprecedented times. Critical lake hits lowest level in 60 years. This is in the U.S. West. One of the most crucial reservoirs throughout the American West reached a historical low level this week, and experts fear worsening conditions could raise longer-term issues. Could? If the lake dries up, it could raise an issue? This is the kind of completely false reporting from so-called scientists that has pacified populations into total apathy. When Lake Powell dries up and it can't produce hydropower, which is coming, and there's no water to flow down into Lake Mead, which will also no longer be able to produce hydropower. Vegas is done, almost done now, almost no water left in Lake Mead either. And ionosphere heaters, as I just described, are a core part of this. When moisture is allowed to flow across the west, they can aerosolize it from above. Too many condensation nuclei, the droplets don't combine and fall as rain, so they can block moisture from falling in that way as well. That's why you have so many days now with this featureless sky, bone dry underneath, nothing falling out, but maybe a slight drizzle here or there. And they can migrate the moisture right across the real estate they want to not allow rain on to somewhere where they choose to utilize that rain. They have multiple methods and means with which to cut off moisture. And with climate engineering, it is far easier for them to create drought than even deluge, and they can do both. But again, let's look at 9/11. As I've stated in this broadcast numerous times before, let's look at that scenario where 1 week after 9/11, former NATO Supreme Commander Wesley Clark was given a list of the countries that were to be targeted immediately after 9/11. A list that clearly existed before 9/11. Every one of those countries subsequently underwent a once in 1,000 year drought. That's mathematically and statistically impossible unless there was some form of intervention, and there was. Climate engineering. It destabilized those countries, made it much easier to control, extract their resources. These dots aren't hard to connect. Not hard to connect at all. The report continues. The western United States and parts of northern Mexico are experiencing their driest period in at least 1,200 years, stated that in the broadcast before, with some calling the unprecedented periods of dryness a, quote, mega drought. Well, yeah, I think you'd call that a mega drought, wouldn't you, in at least 1,200 years? But don't worry, in the U.S. West, the drought monitor says it's not that bad yet, because they don't want you to think it's that bad. The global weather terrorists continue to cut off the flow of precipitation across the U.S. West, and currently only one more round of toxic rain is scheduled for early April for Northern California. And if past patterns prevail, as that period approaches, the scheduled weather script will be further diminished to a few days of drizzle. Just how bad are the forest die-offs in the U.S. West? Please take the time to view and share the just posted 22-minute video report on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org titled Domino Effect, Weather Warfare, Wasted Forests, and Worldwide Collapse of Ecosystems. And while you're at it, look at our reporting from nearly a decade ago and see how accurate that was. Search Engineered Drought Catastrophe, Target California. Please share these reports with anyone you can. Help us to sound the alarm. If we can expose the insanity, we have a chance of stopping it from the inside out. New from Vox.com and other sources, why we still don't yet know how bad climate migration will get. That report states, as sea levels rise, temperatures become unbearable, and disasters grow more severe, tens of millions of people may not be able to stay where they are. Again, could, may, might. You're going to need a snorkel in parts of Florida soon. Miami's already spending $1 billion a year to keep their streets somewhat dry. Sea level rise is increasing exponentially, and these so-called scientists behind this report say that someday it could, may, might be a problem. Life in the asylum. In addition to weather warfare operations, what else is the U.S. military juggernaut of environmental destruction up to, as mentioned at the start of this broadcast? Again, this headline is Super Polluting Pentagon's Climate Plan Just Military-Grade Greenwash. U.S. military aims for net zero by 2050, but with a carbon footprint greater than 140 countries, critics say it needs radical change. You think? That report, the Department of Defense, the entity that is the U.S. war machine, is the largest institutional contributor to global warming on planet Earth. Something the U.S. military doesn't acknowledge. The U.S. military has about 800 installations in 80 countries and another 740 bases at home. Isn't it interesting how America points fingers at other countries? And some of them deserve to have fingers pointed at them. But while we have the proverbial log in our own eye, our bases in everybody's backyard and on their border, that's called empire. This report continues, wars don't help. Some of the first targets in conflict zones are oil infrastructure and power plants. The U.S. military frequently targets oil tankers in Syria, and just last week, Russian missiles attacked a number of oil and gas facilities in Ukraine. The resulting fires give rise to heavy emissions. And, of course, the populations that breathe those emissions all too often succumb to many dire health effects and impacts. How well does that serve the global controllers? You decide. Does anyone remember the environmental catastrophe that was the oil well fires in Kuwait? Official estimates state that there were over 700 of them. How many still believe the official lie that the Kuwait oil fire cataclysm was the doing of Saddam Hussein? Wrong answer. That is exactly what the controllers needed the public to believe, and the vast majority were all too willing to take the bait. Who set the fires? U.S. Special Forces. And please don't believe me. Do some real investigation, and while doing so, stop and think about it. Think about this scenario for a moment, and the puzzle pieces become much more clear and easy to assemble. Before the Kuwait conflict even began, power structure companies and contractors like Halliburton and Bechtel Power, a corrupt company that I formerly worked for, were conducting meetings and planning. They knew they would be setting up shop in Kuwait to put out the well fires that were a month away from even occurring. How did they know? How do you think the cancer that currently controls the world lays out their plans weeks, months, years, and even decades in advance? The entire Kuwait scenario provided a massive foothold for the U.S. military machine and the criminal contractors who serve it. A foothold in one of the most oil-rich regions in the entire world. Just a coincidence, right? No. All part of the plan. Final sentence in the Pentagon report.